We're now going to begin our last session of the afternoon. Many of you were at our conference 2 years ago in New York City, and will recall that the true highlight of that conference took place when Celia Sands, who's one of our honorary co-chairs this year, sat down and had a one-on-one conversation with Jane Williams, who was the secretary for Winston Churchill. And Jane very much wanted to be with us here this year, but is no longer able to make that transatlantic journey. But she worked very closely with Andrew Roberts, our next speaker, when he was writing his book, Walking with Destiny. And she's very prominently mentioned in the acknowledgments. And so what she's done is she has written a letter and asked me to read it out to you by way of introducing Andrew Roberts. So this is her letter. It is with the deepest sadness that I find it is not possible for me to be once again with the International Churchill Society at your annual gathering. Each year brings more understanding and appreciation of the extraordinary triumphs and tragedies in the life of Winston Churchill. Over 1,000 books have been written about him. Churchill will forever live in our hearts and minds. When last year I read Andrew Roberts' great biography, Churchill Walking with Destiny, I was overwhelmed with emotion, with amazement at the sheer volume and understanding of the human being that is Winston Churchill and which Andrew has brought before us. I got in touch with my friend David Freeman, who, amongst other duties, is the editor of Finest Hour, and told him that I considered Andrew Roberts' Walking with Destiny is the finest biography and account of the life of Winston Churchill I had ever read. I worked from 1949 through 1955 as one of Churchill's secretaries. This period covered his writing of his war memoirs as well as becoming a peacetime prime minister from 1951 to 1955. So much covered in Andrew's vivid prose describes events that are familiar to me. The visits to President Eisenhower, the painting in beautiful places throughout the world, but throughout, concentrated, meticulous work. Everything in that great mind was spoken out loud for the secretaries to inscribe in shorthand. He drove us and rarely gave us praise, but he had subtle ways of showing his approval, and we would not have had it otherwise. I would like to draw attention in Andrew's great work to a couple of descriptions that touched me particularly. On page 57, it is this description in September 1898 of the charge of the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman. Churchill wrote to his mother, quote, "I never felt the slightest nervousness and felt as cool as I do now." The importance of staying calm and retaining high morale in the face of heavy odds was to remain with Churchill until the end of his life. Please also read carefully the description of Churchill's period as Home Secretary, 1910 and 1911, where I noticed his capacity for affection, particularly towards his family, and his loyalty to those whom he had known long and who had served him well. This magnanimity is legendary, and he hated vindictiveness above all things. He would say to us, "I cannot stand a witch hunt." Patience, however, was a virtue with which he was totally unfamiliar. His temper was like lightning, but the sun never went down without a gesture that all was forgiven. There, in the end, was the smile. Walking with Destiny is in no way a hagiography. Qualities and characteristics are fully, honestly, and meticulously described. The maps, the page notes, the family tree, the beautiful illustrations all contribute to a work that can be described as a masterpiece. Thank you, Andrew. I am so grateful for this tribute. Jane Williams. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much also for those kind words, David, and those kind words from Jane. I don't believe what she says with regard to the family tree, owing to the fact that I have somebody who is in the family tree who died before they were born. You get these kind of things crop up. I know all the authors in this room, of which there are so many, will appreciate that does happen occasionally, but nonetheless. I'd like to talk about the present state of Churchill's reputation this afternoon, because it is under attack now almost as much as any other time, in fact, any other time since the 1990s. It seems to go up and down and up and down, and at the moment there is a pretty sustained assault on it. And what one needs to do in these occasions is pretty much always to go back to the original sources, to go to Churchill archives, which were so well run by Piers Brendan, who's here in the audience, and are presently wonderfully run also, of course, by Alan Packwood, and to look at the original sources and to see what genuinely Churchill wrote or said, rather than than what the detractors are pretending that he wrote or said. So I'm going to go through a few, if it's all right, of, I think, the most egregious of the factually incorrect remarks that are being made about Churchill at the moment, not least so that all of you, when you come up at a dinner party or in conversation with somebody who is a believer in this assault on Churchill, to have a very good line of defence. The lady who's just turned up with her daughter was the American editor and publisher of Walking with Destiny, and I want you all to give her a big round of applause, please. I'd like to take you back to that wonderful and emotional and also freezing cold moment on the 12th of November 1940 at Westminster Abbey, when Winston Churchill was giving his eulogy to Neville Chamberlain. It was freezing cold, not just because it was in November, but also because they'd taken all the windows out, all the stained glass windows out of Westminster Abbey in order to protect them against the Blitz, and they put up some boarding which didn't work with regard to the cold. And so they were all in their overcoats, and they were listening to this extraordinary speech, one of the greatest speeches that Churchill ever gave, in which he famously said, "History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles across the trails of the past, trying to reconstruct its themes, to revive its echoes and kindle with pale gleams the passions of former days." Sentences like that remind us why he deserved the Nobel Prize for Literature. Yet it wasn't really a speech about history. It was a speech about the role of conscience and of reputation in politics. And it's about Churchill's reputation, as I mentioned, that I'd like to speak today. One good thing is that ultimately it doesn't matter what the revisionists say, because the established view of Churchill is already there. There will be attacks, but nonetheless, the British have an established view. Not just the British, of course. He's in the rotunda here in Washington. Chartwell, the numbers of people going to Chartwell keep going up. There's an American warship named after him. He wins those BBC polls about who is the greatest Briton. I think sometimes to the slight irritation of the BBC, by the way. What he himself called the grievous inquest of history has sat, and he has been found not guilty. However, because all history is, in a sense, growing upon what has been written before, it's important that we've moved now from the hagiography, frankly, some very hagiographical accounts in the 1950s, through to the 1970s, when there was a new vicious tone that came about with regard to history of Churchill. And then it got a bit better, and now it's gone crazy, in my view. But I'd like to look back on some of the things that we had to face. From the left came Clive Ponting, who argued that Churchill probably knew about Pearl Harbor before it took place. What an appalling libel that is. The idea that Winston Churchill, who loved America, who was somebody who appreciated and admired the United States Navy, would have allowed an attack on Pearl Harbor to have taken place solely in order to try and get the Americans into the war, when even the intention to attack Pearl Harbor would have got the Americans into the war, I think is a despicable remark to have made. We've gone through, of course, I think now to the nth degree, the attacks on him about being an alcoholic. Clive Ponting kept saying that he was, but it strikes me that we now appreciate that he was somebody who had an iron constitution for alcohol. He drank a lot of it, but he was in no way dependent on it. We have from the right a man, Robert Rako, a Don called Rako, who calls him a war criminal, the stooge of Stalin, and a drug addict. They rarely take refuge in understatement, these revisionists. Then Nicholson Baker, a novelist, who quotes, who tried to argue that Churchill was as bad as Hitler. And he says, and he quotes Churchill saying in 1920 about mustard gas, saying that it's about mustard gas, "I'm strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes." But when one goes to the Churchill archives in Cambridge and reads the original there, what he actually said was making his eyes water by the use of lacrimatory gas. Gases can be used which would cause great inconvenience and spread a lively terror, yet would leave no serious permanent effect on most of those affected. What he was talking about, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, was tear gas. And if you can't tell the difference between tear gas on one side and mustard gas or chlorine or phosgene gas or Zyklon B even on the other, then you should not be writing history books. He says, Nicholson Baker, by the way, in his book, I used Wikipedia during the writing of the book, especially to check facts. Considering that Wikipedia has a reason that I was expelled from school, which bears no relation to the truth at all, I hasten to point out, I would try to argue that you should never use Wikipedia, especially not to check facts. There's another point in Nicholson Baker's book where he quotes an article by Churchill saying, talking about Trotsky, in 1922, he might have made dictator of Russia, but for one fatal obstacle. He was a Jew. He was still a Jew. Nothing could ever get over that, such intolerance, he writes. When you read the rest of the piece, and it implies that Churchill was being anti-Semitic, when you read the rest of the piece, he went on and said, such intolerance, such pettiness, such bigotry were indeed hard to bear. Now, Baker must have seen those following lines. In order to have quoted from the original ones, his eyes must have continued on into the following sentence, which completely undermine the point that he was trying to make about Churchill being an anti-Semite. So it's fundamentally, intellectually dishonest not to take into account the following lines. We have attacks from over the internet that Churchill was responsible for the sinking of the Lusitania, that he had a secret peace treaty with Mussolini that somehow ended up at the bottom of Lake Como. This was one that we had on the internet, but it was in a sealed container at the bottom of Lake Como. So if any of you are interested in deep-sea diving, ladies and gentlemen, please go down, try and find the secret peace treaty with Mussolini, which otherwise doesn't seem to have survived in any of the archives, understandably, because it never existed. Editors, of course, will always go for stories about Churchill. We've had Churchill the Flasher because he didn't protect himself when FDR came into the bathroom. even though actually we do know that he did. But part of the story is that he did cover himself with his towel before he made that very funny remark. We have had fascinating stories about the extent to which he knew or didn't know about Pamela Harriman's affair with Averell Harriman, Pamela then Churchill affair, which is something that, unfortunately, I'd like to have got to the bottom of this. I'm sure other historians would have, but it's just simply not the kind of thing that people would have written about in those days, whether or not it was true. My favourite headline was the one in The Guardian, Churchill was a non-smoker. Sometimes, of course, these things do come out, and they're correct. But the one about Churchill being a druid is obviously something that we all enjoy. But then there are books, entire books. There was one written a few years back which tried to argue that Winston Churchill allowed Martin Bormann to escape from the ruins of Berlin in April 1945. And the man who wrote it, this book, called Operation JB, and JB was named James Bond, so something tells me that it was unlikely to have been true. But he put up £250,000, this writer, to anyone who could prove that it was untrue that Winston Churchill put Martin Bormann up in a house in the home counties in England in order to debrief him after the end of the Second World War. And when Martin Bormann's skeleton was found and DNA'd successfully in Berlin, this man changed the view of whether or not he was going to, he'd actually ever genuinely promised £250,000. We've had Margaret Cook, the wife, the widow of Robin Cook, the former Foreign Secretary, saying that Winston Churchill was, quote, almost homosexual, unquote. Churchill was entirely tolerant of homosexuality. He had many, many gay friends. He had people who he knew were gay at a time when you could be arrested and imprisoned for this. And it made no effect on him, it seems, whatsoever. But the idea of trying to make him out posthumously himself to have been whatever almost homosexual means strikes me as completely absurd. There are legitimate issues, many legitimate issues on which one can be critical of Winston Churchill. Of course there are. He himself used to make jokes about what a bad Chancellor of the Exchequer he'd been. He was the first, in many cases, to admit that he'd made mistakes and blunders in his life. Indeed, as he wrote, of course, famously from the trenches to Clementine, his wife, I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes. So when people debate the Sydney Street siege and his actions during that, or the Dardanelles, or his opposition to women's suffrage, for example, these are perfectly acceptable ways to attack Winston Churchill. Not, however, with regard to the suffragettes. As a lady in the Jaipur Literary Festival 2 years ago, told me that Winston Churchill had given an order to the police to I'm trying to tell, we've got a young lady, a very young lady present here, but to essentially molest the suffragettes. So, of course, needless to say, I was sitting next to this Indian academic, and I said, oh, that's fascinating. Gosh, how interesting. I've been working on Churchill for some time now, and I'd really like to see that the evidence that you have for that. And she said, I intuited it. You can attack Winston Churchill over the Irish partition, over the gold standard, which he himself, of course, criticised himself later on, over the general strike, Tonipandi and Llanelli. I don't think very many people would go so far as John Macdonald did. John McDonnell, sorry, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and the number 2 man to Jeremy Corbyn earlier this year. And when asked whether or not Churchill was a hero or a villain, he immediately said villain. It says a lot, by the way, about the modern Labour Party that you can have the number 2 person just immediately say that Winston Churchill was a villain on the basis, as I say, of industrial relations issues in South Wales in 1911, and to ignore all the other things that make it clear that he was the exact opposite of a villain. You can criticise him over the abdication crisis and Indian self-government, over the Norway campaign and not publicising the Clementine massacre. But in each of these things, it's vital, again, to go back to the original sources. Very often, of course, Martin Gilbert's companion volumes, which are now being heroically finished off by Hillsdale College, and to look at the context and to look at the truth of these things rather than the revisionists' accounts of them. There are perfectly understandable wartime reasons why Churchill and the Foreign Office did not admit that they knew who was really responsible for the Katyn massacre, namely, of course, Joseph Stalin, and continue to pretend that it was the Nazis. At the time, in the Second World War, for every 5 Germans killed in combat on the battlefield, 4 were killed on the Eastern Front. It was raison d'etat, realpolitik, that meant that he had to say what he said over the Katyn massacre. Other lines of assault could be Singapore, the fall of Singapore, the air cover for HMS Repulse and the Prince of Wales, Russian convoys. The whole Mediterranean strategy has been attacked by no less a great military historian than Professor Sir Michael Howard, who once interviewed General Senger and Ettelin, the German commander at Monte Cassino, and at the end of their long discussion over this, the German general said, "Next time you invade Italy, don't start at the bottom." The issue of unconditional surrender is obviously something it's worthwhile discussing, whether or not Churchill was bounced into it by FDR at the Casablanca conference. The bombing of Dresden, of course, perfectly acceptable to discuss whether or not that was a step too far. Churchillians will argue, and in my view they'd be right to argue, that it was demanded by the Soviets, that there were railway marshalling yards that needed to be hit to prevent the Germans from moving troops from one side of the operational theatre to the other, and other aspects, the very high death rate that came as a result of the Gauleiter not providing proper shelters. But nonetheless, it's okay to have a discussion over this. I think personally Churchill can be defended on almost every single one that I've mentioned, and there are more. But what is not acceptable, it strikes me, is the cheating that you get again and again, and the way in which people try to attack Churchill using very modern, often politically correct attitudes, especially, of course, towards race, that simply wouldn't have meant anything at the time, and certainly not to him. The Bengal famine is a disgraceful and completely, in my view, unacceptable way to attack Winston Churchill. Dr. Mukherjee and, of course, the Indian nationalist, Hindu nationalist bigot, Shashi Tharoor, have accused Winston Churchill of deliberately engineering the deaths of millions of Bengalis. And the number that they come up with is, of course, 6 million, not because there's any historical background to the idea of there being genuinely 6 million. It's just that the echo of the phrase 6 million, of course, has such powerful Holocaust connections as to be a line that they love to take in order to try to equate Winston Churchill with Adolf Hitler. But look at what genuinely happened. Of course, I go into this in my book for 6 or 7 pages, and you can check it out there as far as the details are concerned. But overall, the big picture is that in October 1942, a huge cyclone hit Bengal. And as well as wiping out the rice crop on which the local residents had lived for generations, it also destroyed the road and rail communications, which would have been used in order to have brought in food into that area. And also, at the time, places that we had in the past when these horrific acts of God took place, we would be able to buy in food from places like Malaya and Thailand and Burma. That was completely impossible when the Japanese were in occupation of all 3 of those countries. The Japanese fleet had bombed shelled eastern Indian cities. They had submarines in the Bay of Bengal. The idea that Winston Churchill was responsible for the deaths that took place, the horrific deaths that took place. Yes, mistakes were made, and they were made by Calcutta, and they were made by the local provincial councils, which, by the way, at that stage were run by Muslim and Hindu local native majorities. The idea that Churchill, simply because he made what today to modern ears are unacceptable jokes, racially based jokes, the idea that because of that he actually wanted millions of people to die is a completely unacceptable, in my view, twisting of the genuine historical truth. We can argue about the bombing of Auschwitz and why it didn't happen. There were, in this actually, it strikes me that it's a indication of not just bombing Auschwitz itself, but also bombing the railway lines to and from Auschwitz. A huge indication that Winston Churchill was not a dictator in Britain. He's been accused of being one. But were he one, he would have insisted on the RAF bombing these railway lines. It's notoriously difficult to bomb a railway line, in fact. And of course, it also required the RAF or the USAAF or both to cross hundreds of miles into Poland to do this. But nonetheless, he said, "Invoke me if necessary," to Anthony Eden. And it was stopped at several layers below him, not least by John McCloy and others in the American authorities. But were he a genuine dictator, as he's accused of being, he would have bombed those railway lines. Yalta, any number of lines of attack on him at Yalta. Frankly, if you're an MP like Winston Churchill for 2/3 of a century, at the height of politics, for 2/3 of a century, and also, of course, somebody like him who never shied away from any issue either, of course you're going to be able to be attacked for various things. You've crossed the floor of the House not once but twice. And there are certain lines of attack, I think, that come back again and again. There's the Tory nationalist, the extreme nationalist line that was purveyed by the late Alan Clark and the late Maurice Cowling, in which he was attacked for not accepting Adolf Hitler's peace offer in May 1940, the May in the summer of 1940. Because it led to socialism and it led to the loss of the empire. Apparently, it led to our great power status going. But actually, if you look at what would have happened had Churchill not been there, if Lord Halifax, who was then Foreign Secretary, but of course later became Prime Minister, could have become Prime Minister instead of Churchill, had he accepted that peace offer, in every possible permutation or combination of the future, we would have been in a wildly worse situation. This was a man who ripped up Adolf Hitler, a man who ripped up every treaty that he ever signed. The idea of keeping on the the empire is an absurdity as well. After 1935, it was going. It was moving. At least the important part of it, India, was moving towards self-government. What it would have meant with regard to demoralization here in the United States, demoralization in Britain, but also the lack of support in the United States at the time of Lend-Lease, if we'd done some kind of ignoble deal with Germany, there was simply no way that the United States would have continued in its support and affection for the British. So, again and again, I think one can just argue these points through on straightforward intellectual lines, and again, Winston Churchill actually comes out extraordinarily well from the intellectual exercise. We've seen in the last 12 months a series of attacks. Nigel Hamilton has brought out a book about FDR, which claims that Winston Churchill was always opposed to D-Day. And that is simply not the case, ladies and gentlemen. From June 1940, from the time of Dunkirk, he was planning to return to the continent one way or another. It doesn't mean that he wanted to do it as early as General Marshall in the fall of 1942, but it was always in the back of his mind. He wouldn't have put so much capital behind the Mulberry Harbours and the pipeline under the ocean and the various inventions and the landing crafts and the tank and so on, so forth, the various tank alterations, unless he had seen one day there would be a return. But he wasn't going to do that, ladies and gentlemen, before there was two things that had been done. The first, of course, was victory in the air war over northwest France. On the day of D-Day itself, when the Luftwaffe flew 318 missions, 318 over the beaches of Dunkirk, the Allies flew 13,688. That is the level of air superiority that was necessary for that operation. And of course also they needed to have won the Battle of the Atlantic. And that wasn't won until the late summer of 1943. In January 1942, the Germans added a fourth rotor to the Enigma machine, plunging all of the decrypts into gobbledygook. And it wasn't until the December of that year that the boffins at Bletchley Park were able to break back into the Shark Code, German naval codes, and to work out, therefore, whereabouts the wolf packs, the U-boats, were meeting. So we were able to send bombers and destroyers there. If it had happened any earlier than that, there was a serious danger that the Germans would have been able to have counterattacked, and a successful German counterattack against D-Day, against the Normandy operation, could have set back the whole war a year or so. And can you imagine the welter of blood that would have happened as a result of that? My old Don at Cambridge, Norman Stone, told me that nothing is inevitable in history. No historian should ever use the word inevitable. It's the one word you should never use, because nothing is inevitable in history except for German counterattack. And you only have to look at Caen, and you look at Salerno and Anzio, and the great, and of course the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. 39 divisional attack marching through the snow, with sending searchlights up on the clouds so that they could turn night into day, to all the messages sent by motorbikes, so that none of our radio decryptors were able to hear any of the plans for this. You think that they were capable of doing that in December 1944, imagine what would have happened in the autumn of 1942 or in 1943. So it is simply untrue, this latest assault on Churchill's reputation by Nigel Hamilton and others. And then, of course, we had in the last year, Richard Toye and Warren Doctor claiming that Winston Churchill was unfaithful to Clementine with Lady Castle Ross. based on a fascinating and it's great to listen to interview of Jock Colville with Bill Barnett. Thank you, Piers, with Bill Barnett. Yes, my favourite bit of the tape. And I must admit, when I heard it the first time, I did sit up straight to listen to this. My favourite bit of the tape, actually there are lots of funny parts of the tape, but actually it's when you look more closely again into the actual evidence, that you see again and again how completely absurd and wrong and ridiculous this is. And it's not just because Winston Churchill fell in love with Clementine on the day he met her for the second time in 1908 and stayed desperately in love with her for the whole of the rest of his life. It's actually a letter in which Lady Castleross, after supposedly a 4-year affair with Churchill, writes him a note and gives him her telephone number, which is a 4-digit code. And it strikes me, if you've had an affair with a woman for 4 years, you're going to remember her 4-digit telephone number. There are other circumstantial pieces of evidence to suggest that this is complete rubbish and just yet another of these attacks on Winston Churchill that sensible people and people who are interested in the evidence and actually going and finding out the truth simply will not believe. So I'm going to end with the rest of the paragraph, the peroration indeed, of Churchill's speech on that freezing cold winter day in November 1940, when he was speaking about Neville Chamberlain's reputation, of course, but also, I think, as so often with Winston Churchill when he was giving eulogies, he was also slightly referring to himself. And he said, "What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. It's very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we always march in the ranks of honour." Ladies and gentlemen, Winston Churchill, he marches there still. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. So we have some time for some questions. If anybody would like to go into, gentleman there. There's a microphone that's being sprinting towards you.
Thank you. Is there a corollary possibly between January of 42 and the possibility of America and Great Britain forming an alliance after Brexit?
Right. Sorry. I thought this was going to be a question about Churchill's reputation. And yeah, well, I so hope so. As you can imagine, it would be magnificent if we were to have a really comprehensive trade deal with the United States, a free trade deal of some really generous and understanding and large kind, a settlement financially that would be able to help us get over the inevitable dislocations that we're going to have post-Brexit, then wonderful. And if you're asking me to equate Donald Trump and FDR or Boris and Winston Churchill, I'm not quite ready to do that. But having said that, I'm delighted that we have, as Prime Minister, somebody who's written a book about Winston Churchill, who's interested in him, who and has learnt a few of the lessons, not least that of audacity. Next question.
Thank you. As part of the Churchill youth movement here, I know that a lot of modern day scholars will throw charges at Churchill and also another great figure you've profiled, Napoleon, for their imperial ambitions. So imperialism, as you're well aware, has fallen on very hard times. I'd be interested in hearing how you would handle that particular challenge to both Churchill, Napoleon's more complicated perhaps, but along imperial lines. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very good question, and you're right. It does come up an awful lot. Actually, not hugely in this country, but in England an awful lot, and especially at universities, wherever I speak at universities, colonialism and imperialism and Churchill's support for those concepts are very much held against him. And what I like to remind my listeners on these occasions is that Winston Churchill was actually alive whilst Charles Darwin was alive, when it was considered, generally considered, that there was a hierarchy of the races, something which we consider to be today know to be absurd and obscene. But at the time it was considered to be scientific fact. And therefore, I don't think that Winston Churchill should be singled out in any way for having considered that imperialism was a worthwhile thing, because you have to appreciate that his form of imperialism was entirely different from the neo-Darwinists, from people, well, certainly like the Nazis, because his assumption was that if the British race was on a higher plane in so many ways from the native peoples of the empire, it was an absolute moral duty to do everything in order to help improve the lives of the native peoples. That is precisely 100% different from the assumption of the neo-Darwinists and the Nazis that actually that gave you carte blanche to treat everybody else as slaves. And so there is a massive moral difference, and one that I never find terribly difficult to explain to people. It's wonderful that you are doing something to tell the future generations about Winston Churchill, and that would be the line to take if I were you, because intelligent people can always understand it. The only people who don't want to understand it are the people who, for ideological or political reasons, will not understand it. Sir, here's your microphone.
I'm very impressed with your.
Yes, it is.
I'm very impressed with your presentation today, and also with your book that I own.
Thank you.
It's very helpful. But you've said something that's really caught my attention. You're talking about he was not a dictator. Had he been, he probably would have bombed the railway lines and everything to the death camps. Well, I've never understood why they did nothing about the death camps, but how was Britain operating? Who would have made the decision to not bomb those camps?
Well, it was a joint decision, of course, because it was the United States Air Force that would have done this as well. And this has been looked into, as you can imagine, in enormous detail. The people at whose desks it seems to just sort of slip away are John McCloy and Anthony Eden. Of course, they didn't know precisely what was going on. The photographs that we see when you visit Auschwitz and you see the selection ramps, that photograph was not actually developed during the Second World War. It was developed almost immediately after the Second World War. It's one of those horrific moments where if only they had developed it a year earlier, they would have had a far better idea. And you see everything, including smoke coming out from one of the crematoria chimneys. But that was not discovered until after the war. You did have, of course, some incredibly brave people, including Poles, Jan Korski and others, who came back and told people. There were some photographs, but there wasn't enough for McCloy and Eden to send the bombers halfway across Europe and bomb railway lines, which, as I mentioned earlier are very difficult to hit. Margaret Thatcher once explained to me why a railway line is difficult to hit, which is a wonderful person to tell you about that kind of thing. The reason is that if, according to Margaret, I haven't double-checked with anybody else, that if the first bomb doesn't align with the railway line, all the others are going to go off and not hit it. So you basically have to go along the railway line or crisscross it in the hope that it's going to hit. Very difficult thing to do. Is that the lot? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.